that we could legislate in the right way. We no longer need to be a sovereign people with freedom to contest and revise how we organise our state. And that's where Honig fits in, when she sees this as the kind of, as the undecidability, the uncertainty on which the social contract rests, and why it's this process of continuous contracting. And the same with the legislator. The legislator could be a political genius, but also could be a political charlatan that manipulates the people. And there's no guarantees in politics. It's this absence of a foundation, if you want, that you're recognising there, and the fact that people who are supposed to provide the foundation for the state through their agreement to the contract, through their general will, in fact provide an uncertain foundation for the state, which nourishes the democratic potential of the social contract, makes it this process of continuous contracting, where we're constantly rethinking, revitalising our communal bonds in the face of their potential betrayal.
And do you see pity as operative in the what you call the identification with the legislator? I mean, is that what's getting you to this political foundation?
That's an interesting point, because I haven't necessarily thought through the question of pity there, in terms of its role of the legislator. I would say that probably pity is fundamental to the beginnings of recognising the need to enter the contract based on, you know, the mutual reciprocation of rights and obligation. I'm not sure where that level of identification fits in with the legislator and that process of identifying that aspect change that the legislator is supposed to produce in us, where we no longer see ourselves as closed, but we begin to see ourselves as part of a community and recognise how our identity was always worked out through communal relations. And I suppose on that level, this feeling of not being self-sufficient perhaps could be useful for things to say.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
I had a really brief question about how you see the relation between the ontological and the social in Rousseau.
Right.
Because it's really interesting hearing where there may be points of kind of proximity between Nancy and Rousseau, more than one would think if one just follows Nancy's reading. I guess because I'm really interested in the way that you're linking the two through kinds of notions of finitude, and exposure of beings to one another, being with. I wondered if you still see points of divergence between the two, if you think that points of divergence remain between Nancy and Rousseau. So, for example, I'm thinking about the notion of the project, like a community as a common project, and the way in which the social contract seems to denote some kind of common project, general will.
Very much so.
And whether you see kind of Nancy's idea of community as désœuvrement, as unworking, as, you know, the very kind of unravelling of a common project. Whether you see that as a point of divergence.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting question again. Well, I think, you know, I was slightly unfair in the way that I presented Nancy's reading of Rousseau, because I think he says that Rousseau's important because he also thinks dislocation as the beginning of social formation as well. But what he tends to do, Nancy makes a very clear distinction between community and society, and that's a very useful distinction for the kinds of things I'm talking about, of the difference between social order and my sense of community, because you want to keep those two separate, and I think Nancy is good for that. And perhaps Rousseau doesn't distinguish between these terms, association, community and society, quite as clearly. To come back to your question about points of divergence, one of the things that interests me in Nancy is I think you've got two ideas of community there. You've got, and I might be wrong here, you've got an identarian notion of community, a community that based on this mythic common essence of identity. And that's what allows us to go from the kind of finite community to a kind of political community, is the use of myth. That process of how we narrativize what we share in common to ourselves. And what Nancy says is that there will be, at some point, that the finite community will, it's the interaction between the two, the finite community will disrupt that myth. And he sees that as almost something inevitable, as it will kind of produce contestation, as suddenly we realise the plural sense of what we think is common, excludes. And what I'm trying to think through is, how do you actually get people to respond to that moment when the myth of the common, the moment when they realise that what they're community excludes requires action of them, because it's not enough just for contingency just to be there. Contingent things happen all the time. It's not enough that the kind of myth of community, or that an event happens that in fact questions our sense of the common, because there's nothing to say that we respond to that. There's nothing to say, and I think what Rousseau does is try to think through a little bit more, and I'm not saying he gives us all the answers, but trying to think through the way in which you prevent a community from sliding into an identarian politics, from sliding into a state of apathy where it just accepts the common as the full embodiment of the common and recognises its obligation to, in fact, maybe more consciously contest or think through the limits of what it wills in common. But I don't see this as a weakness in Nancy, because my reading is significantly, obviously, draws on Nancy's work, and I see Rousseau maybe as a supplement to rather than a critique of Nancy, that perhaps what Nancy doesn't do is tell us enough about what keeps us together as a community without going into an identarian mode of politics, without slipping into that. What allows us to perhaps have a self-critical mode of community where we kind of remain open to otherness, to things that contest our community, and respond to that. Okay.
Thank you. Sadly, it is past 7 o'clock, so I think we need to stop there. But Kevin, you've helped us to understand Rousseau there, and also to explore our own thoughts wonderfully. I thought that was incredibly helpful discussion time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And thank you again for the paper.
Thank you.